Hello, this is Hilbert Copeland recording his reflective vlog for Module 11. Module 11 was an exploration of the connection between macro practice and micro practice. The first thing that students were asked to consider was the difference between micro and macro practice intervention strategies and the role of the social worker as change agent. And I think to really consider those questions, to really get to the heart of that conversation, it's really necessary to talk about how Hepworth et al. Define macro practice. So Hepworth et al. Define macro practice as being professionally guided interventions in which the targets are social problems and conditions, or the practice, this is an alternative definition or a continuation, or the practice of helping people solve social problems and makes social change at the community, organizational, societal, and global levels. So the prevailing belief in terms of macro practice is that macro practitioners see the whole picture, and their interventions can ultimately change the lives of a multitude of people with the interventions that they provide. So a lot of this macro practice understanding and knowledge can be traced back to the settlement house movement. And so as such, we do see a clear connection between social change and personal change, i.e. macro practice and micro practice. So social workers should realize that macro practice is traditionally an extension of micro practice. It allows for the envisioning of issues beyond the individual, family, or group, and highlight micro concerns that really require macro changes or interventions or practices. Micro observations can lead to macro actions. To what extent are individual problems pervasive among the larger group experience to which the individual belongs? So the text, the direct skills practice book by Hepworth et al. Really indicates to student that there is this unbreakable connection between micro practice and macro practice. And truly, they should inform one another. And I think what's really interesting is this concept of, as a practitioner, as a social worker, one might come across an instance where they kind of see a continued pattern of behaviors or concerns or target issues. And they realize that a macro intervention would really be the ticket in solving these problems. The text highlights this really interesting example dealing with child support and job availability and accessibility, and how that could treat a micro level problem. The three strategies that are really introduced in this text for intervention is developing and mobilizing resources, engaging in advocacy and social action, and engaging in community organization. So one of the primary differences between these macro practice interventions and micro practice interventions is that micro practice interventions really focus on individual, families, and groups, how to service them. And usually they're working towards some kind of individual goal, even if they're a part of a larger unit. We know that group intervention is traditionally used to help those clients who are seeking to find individual goals and realize them, but in a group setting where they can be supported. Whereas when we're talking about talking about these macro interventions, we're talking about the benefit and the goals of an entire group or culture or chunk of society or community. So really at this level, much further out than individual. The developing and mobilization of resources is something that would traditionally be outside of a micro practice setting. When we're talking about developing and mobilizing resources, traditionally, that reads to me as, and in reference back to some of my skills demonstrations with my partner, Lindsay Edquist, when we took turns role-playing as Gloria and social worker, one of the things that I really focused on was what resources exist within our community that could help you potentially leave your husband or find a remedy to the situation. And we talked about organizations that provided that kind of support. We identified what they were called in the San Antonio area and what kind of services they provide. And so really, I think there's an opportunity to say here that macro practice or micro practitioners can use some of those macro level resources. Engaging in advocacy and social action, again, that's geared towards the entire community, and engaging in community organization almost goes without saying. The latter part of this reflective log includes answering some questions such as what is the difference between micro and macro intervention? I feel like I just covered that really in depth, so I'm gonna go ahead and skip that question in this context. Then, using the Module 5 scenario as developed with your skills demonstration partner, identify a relevant macro level change strategy and discuss how it might be used to target macro level change as related to the circumstances presented in this scenario. Again, this is something that I kind of already discussed, but within the context of this work, resource development includes educating policymakers, civic groups, and administrators of social welfare organizations about social conditions for which responsive resources are needed. Hepworth et al. 2018. In argumenting or developing resources for groups and communities, some specific needs of individuals may also be met. However, as noted by Vossler in 1990, resource needs often go unnoticed, perhaps in large part due to the structure of social welfare services in which the primary focus tends to be on an individual treatment. Because of the emphasis on individual change, the need for aggregate information about whole groups or populations may not be as obvious. Now, this chunk of information came straight from the Hepworth text. And I think what's really worth noting is that we're talking about how oftentimes in social work, we might confuse the issues of a micro practice problem or consideration for really something that would be better solved at the macro level, right? If we're with a client who is suffering because they cannot afford to feed themselves or their family, or they don't have access to basic necessities, which is having an effect on their mental health. We can practice all of the intervention strategies at the micro level that we want, but unfortunately, it still would not provide for the actual need what macro practice would probably be most apt to do. So I think it's, especially in the instance of Gloria, right? It's not necessarily that we're just treating a mental illness or ailment that Gloria is experiencing. Rather, she needs to know the resources and tools that exist that could help her move beyond that so that she can start healing emotionally. Some key ethical considerations that influence targeted change outcomes at that macro level. One, advocacy and social action may constitute a delicate balance of self-determination and beneficence. A social worker has to choose whether or not they're going to empower clients to advocate for themselves, or if they are going to represent them themselves. Whatever the case, the social worker should not empower themselves, should not overpower their community that they are serving, their client, to reflect what they think is best. They should honor self-determination. They should honor their commitment to the community and let that be the vision that they carry out. Additionally, informing groups about inherent conflicts, risks, limitations that are associated with advocacy and social action. It's critically important that a social worker be honest with their client in every scenario. But when we're talking about macro practice and the execution of things like social advocacy and action, communities should be aware that ramifications could exist for the things that they so choose to do. And so if a social worker willingly perpetuates a system that they know their community or client is not okay with, they're really creating a dynamic that goes against the ethics outlined by the National Social Work Association. So it's really important that whether micro or macro practice, clients are informed of those risks. And that's all for a reflective vlog for Module 11. Thank you. I'm Hilbert Copeland.